Most people think they know Elvis Presley, the sequined jumpsuits, the curled lip, the swiveling hips that made mothers nervous and daughters scream, the voice that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than any human chest should reach. But there is a version of Elvis that history nearly buried, a version that didn't perform courage. He lived it, quietly, without cameras, without a publicist telling him it was good for his image. In 1956, at the absolute peak of his early fame, Elvis Presley walked into a restaurant in Mississippi where the rules were simple, brutal, and legally enforced. White people on one side, black people on the other. No exceptions. No negotiations. Elvis looked at those rules, and then he made a choice that nobody in that room expected. This is not the Elvis they sell on refrigerator magnets. This is the real one. To understand what Elvis did that day, you first need to understand the world that made him. Elvis Aaron Presley was born on January 8, 1935, in Tupelo, Mississippi, a town so poor that the hospital where he should have been delivered was simply not an option for his family. His twin brother, Jesse Garon, was stillborn. Elvis came into the world already carrying loss, already knowing that life did not come with guarantees. Tupelo in the 1930s and 1940s was a place of rigid, suffocating racial division. Segregation was not a political opinion. It was architecture. It was written into the sidewalks, the water fountains, the church pews, the school doors. Black families and white families lived parallel lives that the law worked very hard to keep from ever touching. But life, as it always does, found the cracks. Young Elvis Presley grew up in one of those cracks. The Presleys lived in a neighborhood called Shake Rag, a predominantly black community where poverty was the great equalizer. Elvis did not grow up distant from black culture. He grew up inside it. He played with black children. He listened to black preachers, whose voices seemed to shake the walls of their churches. He heard the blues bleeding through the thin walls of neighboring homes at night, that aching music that told the truth about suffering in ways that polished white gospel never dared to. By the time Elvis was a teenager, his musical DNA was already fused. He absorbed gospel from the Blackwood Brothers, R&B from artists like Arthur Crudup and Big Mama Thornton. The raw emotion of the juke joints he wasn't supposed to visit, but visited anyway. His mother, Gladys, watched him with a mixture of pride and quiet terror. She knew her son was different. She just didn't know yet how much the world would punish him for it, and how much he would refuse to be punished. When Elvis walked into Sun's studio in Memphis in 1953 to record a song as a birthday gift for his mother, producer Sam Phillips heard something that stopped him cold. Here was a white boy from Mississippi who carried black music not as an imitation, but as a mother tongue. That tension, that beautiful, complicated, historically loaded tension, would define everything that came next, including what happened in a Mississippi restaurant 3 years later. 1956 was not a normal year. It was a year when the United States looked at itself in the mirror and didn't entirely like what it saw. 1 year earlier, a 14-year-old black boy named Emmett Till had been murdered in Mississippi for allegedly whistling at a white woman. His killers were acquitted in 67 minutes by an all-white jury. His mother, Mamie Till, made the devastating and courageous decision to display her son's mutilated body in an open casket, telling the world, "Look at what you have done." The world looked, and something shifted. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus in December 1955. Montgomery bus boycott, organized by a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr., was still grinding forward through 1956. An act of collective resistance, so disciplined and determined it would eventually break the system it was fighting. Into this, America walked Elvis Presley, 21 years old, impossibly handsome, and suddenly the most famous entertainer in the country. His first television appearances had detonated like bombs. Ed Sullivan initially refused to have him on, calling his performance style inappropriate. When Elvis finally appeared on The Sullivan Show in September 1956, 42% of the entire American population watched. Cameras famously filmed him only from the waist up, as if his hips were a dangerous weapon that needed to be concealed from decent people. White parents across America were horrified. Black artists across America, the ones whose music Elvis had grown up loving, the ones whose style he had absorbed, had complicated feelings. Some resented the fact that a white artist was getting rich and famous performing a sound they had built and been denied credit for. Others recognized something genuine in Elvis, a respect that went beyond imitation. Little Richard said it plainly. Elvis was not stealing. Elvis was channeling. But recognition and respect existed in a separate world from the legal architecture of segregation. In Mississippi in 1956, it didn't matter how famous you were, how much money you made, or whose music you loved. The rules of the Jim Crow South applied to everyone, and they were enforced with violence when necessary. Elvis knew this. He had grown up inside this system, which makes what he did next all the more remarkable. The restaurant has different names depending on who tells the story. What is consistent across accounts is the essential geography of the moment. Elvis Presley entered an establishment in Mississippi, where black customers were either prohibited entirely or forced to use a separate entrance, sit in a separate section, and be served last if they were served at all. Elvis was not alone. He was with members of his entourage, as he usually traveled by 1956, and in that group, or nearby, were black friends and associates, musicians, crew members, people he had worked with and considered companions in the real sense of the word. The restaurant staff made the position clear. Black patrons were not welcome at the main counter. The separation was expected. It was normal. It was the law. Elvis paused. Those who were there describe a moment of stillness that felt longer than it probably was. The kind of pause where everyone in the room suddenly understands that something is being decided. Elvis turned to his black companions, and then he turned back to the restaurant staff. He said, in the polite but immovable tone that people who knew him recognized as his version of absolute firmness, "We eat together or we don't eat here." And they left. No speech. No performance. No press release. No attempt to make himself the hero of a story about someone else's dignity. Just a quiet, unambiguous refusal to participate in a system he found morally repugnant, in a state where that refusal carried real risk. In a year when the consequences of crossing racial lines in Mississippi could be lethal, the staff was stunned. His companions were moved, and the moment dissolved back into the ordinary flow of a complicated day in 1956 America. Elvis never talked about it publicly. That, perhaps, is the most telling detail of all. History loves simple stories. It loves heroes who are entirely heroic and villains who are entirely villainous. It loves moments of resistance that arrive with dramatic music and clear moral lighting. It is uncomfortable with the complicated truth that most real acts of courage are quiet, imperfect, and performed by people who are themselves full of contradictions. Elvis Presley was a contradiction. He was a white man who became extraordinarily wealthy performing music that originated in black communities that received a fraction of the recognition and none of the financial reward he enjoyed. That is true, and it is a legitimate tension that music historians have wrestled with for decades. He was also a man who, in private, consistently refused the racial boundaries his era tried to enforce. He performed at venues that had never hosted integrated audiences and quietly insisted on it. He championed black artists in interviews when it was commercially risky to do so. He idolized Jackie Wilson, B.O. Diddley, and Fats Domino, and said so out loud in Mississippi. In 1956, the restaurant moment matters not because it makes Elvis a civil rights hero. It does not. And he would have been uncomfortable with that title. It matters because it reveals something true about how moral courage actually works in real life. It is rarely the grand gesture. It is usually the small, private, costly decision made in an ordinary moment when no one is watching, and nothing requires you to do the right thing except your own conscience. Elvis had every reason to comply. He was in Mississippi. He was at the height of his fame and had everything to lose. The path of least resistance was right in front of him. He chose the harder path instead, and then he got back in his car and drove away, and never made himself the story. That, more than the music, more than the movies, more than the mythology, that is the Elvis worth remembering. History is full of moments that happened quietly and nearly disappeared. This was one of them. Elvis Presley was not a perfect man, but in a restaurant in Mississippi in 1956, he was exactly the man the moment needed, and he didn't need an audience to do it. If this story moved you, share it. Someone in your life needs to read it today, and tell me in the comments. Did you know this side of Elvis? Or did this change how you see him? I read every single response.